Singapore went from a tiny island with absolutely zero natural resources to one of the richest countries on Earth in just 50 years. The average person living there today is wealthier than the average American. But in 1965, everyone thought Singapore was completely doomed. They had just been kicked out of Malaysia against their will. They had no natural resources whatsoever. They were smaller than New York City. Their unemployment rate was catastrophically high. They were surrounded by neighbors who actively hated them. And they had essentially no military to defend themselves. Their leader looked at this impossible situation and said they would solve all of these crises simultaneously. Everyone told him that was impossible. So how did they pull off one of the most remarkable economic transformations in human history? Before we get to the insane comeback story, let's rewind and see how they got into this desperate mess in the first place. For centuries, Singapore was just a sleepy fishing village in Southeast Asia. Nothing particularly special about it. But in 1819, a British colonial administrator named Stamford Raffles showed up and had a vision. He looked at this swampy, mosquito-infested island and said this place needs a trading port. His colleagues thought he was insane. The place was full of disease-carrying mosquitoes and pirates. But Raffles saw something they didn't. He recognized the location was absolutely perfect. Singapore sat right at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, perfectly positioned to control trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Every ship traveling between Europe, India, and China had to pass through this narrow strait. It was like owning a toll booth on the world's busiest commercial highway. Under British rule, Singapore grew rapidly into a major trading hub. Chinese, Indian, and Malay immigrants flooded in, looking for work and opportunity. The population exploded from a few hundred to hundreds of thousands within decades. Singapore became one of Britain's crown jewels in Asia, a diverse, bustling port city making enormous profits, mostly for the British Empire, but creating wealth throughout the region. Everything was going remarkably well until 1942, when the Japanese invaded during World War II. The British had prepared Singapore as what they called an impregnable fortress. They had massive 15-inch naval guns pointed at the sea, loaded with armor-piercing shells that could destroy any battleship. They were daring the Japanese to attack from the ocean. There was just one small problem. The Japanese didn't attack from the sea. They came from the north, through the jungle that everyone believed was impassable for a modern army. In February 1942, the Japanese captured Singapore in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The British were so confident the attack would come from one direction that they left their entire northern approach completely exposed. That single blind spot cost them everything. During the Japanese occupation, life was absolutely brutal for Singapore's population. Tens of thousands died from violence, starvation, and disease. Food was desperately scarce. The Japanese renamed Singapore to Sionantu, which means light of the south, though most people would describe the occupation as the exact opposite of light. After 3.5 years of suffering, the war finally ended in 1945. The British came back to reclaim their colony, but something fundamental had changed. The local population had watched the mighty British Empire get absolutely demolished by the Japanese in less than a week. Suddenly, British rule didn't seem so invincible or permanent anymore. The locals started demanding independence, arguing they had survived years of occupation while the British were gone and could clearly manage their own affairs. And so began Singapore's complicated journey toward independence. But here's where things get messy. Singapore was tiny, predominantly Chinese in population, and surrounded by Malaya, which was mostly ethnic Malay. The British, looking to exit gracefully from their colonial obligations, thought they had a brilliant idea. What if Singapore just merged with Malaya to form a larger federation? In 1963, Singapore merged with Malaya, Sabah, and Sarawak to form the new nation of Malaysia. It seemed like a logical solution at the time. Singapore would get access to a larger territory and natural resources. Malaysia would gain Singapore's economic expertise and developed port infrastructure. Everyone would benefit, right? Wrong. Almost immediately, severe tensions erupted. The Malaysian federal government, dominated by ethnic Malays, wanted policies that favored ethnic Malays over other racial groups. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's leader, wanted what he called a Malaysian Malaysia, with equality for all races regardless of ethnicity. The Malaysian Prime Minister rejected this vision entirely. He started imposing tariffs on Singapore and implementing discriminatory policies. Tensions escalated rapidly. Race riots broke out in the streets. People died in the violence. The situation became completely untenable for both sides. Finally, in 1965, just 2 years after the merger, the Malaysian Parliament voted to expel Singapore from Malaysia entirely. On August 9, 1965, Singapore became an independent nation against its will. Lee Kuan Yew, the man who had fought so hard to join Malaysia, went on national television and cried actual tears in front of the cameras. Lee wasn't crying because he was happy about independence. He was crying because he genuinely thought Singapore was doomed to fail and collapse. And honestly, looking at the situation objectively, he had extremely good reasons to think that. Let's review Singapore's situation in 1965 with brutal honesty. They had no natural resources whatsoever. No oil, no minerals, not even enough fresh water to sustain their population. They had no military to speak of, just a small police force. They were surrounded by larger neighbors who were at best deeply suspicious and at worst openly hostile. They faced high unemployment and severe racial tensions that threatened to tear society apart. Their economy was almost entirely dependent on British military bases that might leave at any moment. Singapore's chances of survival as an independent nation looked absolutely terrible. Lee Kuan Yew realized that Singapore had exactly one advantage they could leverage: its geographic location. Ships were still passing through the strait in enormous numbers. If Singapore could become the premier port, the dominant trading hub, the financial center of Southeast Asia, maybe, just maybe, they could survive as an independent nation. But there were massive problems to solve first. And by some problems, literally everything about running a country was a problem that needed immediate solutions. Problem number 1 was water. Singapore didn't have enough fresh water to sustain its population. They could import water from Malaysia, but that created dangerous dependency. What happens if Malaysia gets angry and turns off the tap? Singapore would die of thirst within days, so Lee decided they needed their own water supply. He ordered the construction of reservoirs everywhere across the tiny island. Every building's roof became a water collection system. He also ordered engineers to start researching how to turn seawater into drinking water through desalination, even though the technology wasn't economically viable at the time. He told them to develop the technology themselves if necessary. Problem number 2 was the economy. Singapore's main source of income came from British military bases, but the British were planning to withdraw from Asia entirely. Singapore needed industries, factories, and jobs to replace that income. In the 1960s, most developing countries were pursuing economic self-sufficiency. They put up trade barriers, tried to manufacture everything domestically, and told foreign companies to stay away. Lee Kuan Yew looked at this prevailing strategy and decided it was completely stupid for Singapore's situation. Singapore was too tiny to be self-sufficient. They didn't have the resources or the market size. So Lee decided to do the exact opposite of conventional wisdom. Singapore would become the most business-friendly place on earth. His strategy was simple but radical. Zero tolerance for corruption, efficient government bureaucracy, low taxes, strong rule of law, and property rights. Singapore would invite every foreign company to set up operations there. They would be the bridge between East and West, the place where international business happened in Asia. Other developing countries criticized Singapore as sellouts to Western capitalism. Lee's response was dismissive. Let them think what they want. In 20 years, we'll be rich and they'll still be poor. Problem number 3 was housing. Most Singaporeans lived in slums at the time, literal overcrowded, unsanitary, fire-prone slums. Lee visited these slums personally and declared the situation completely unacceptable. His advisors told him they didn't have money for public housing. He told them to find the money. He wanted everyone in Singapore to have a decent home within a single generation. They told him that was impossible. He responded by saying everything is impossible until someone actually does it. The government launched the most ambitious public housing program in modern history. The Housing Development Board started building apartments at a breakneck pace across the island. But here's the genius part of the policy. They didn't just give people homes as welfare. They made the apartments affordable to purchase. Singapore introduced the Central Provident Fund, essentially a mandatory savings program. Every worker had to save part of their salary automatically, and they could use those savings to buy their government-built apartment. This meant people owned their homes rather than renting. They had a personal financial stake in the country's success. The government got money back to build more housing. Everyone accumulated retirement savings automatically. It was brilliantly designed policy. By the 1980s, over 80% of Singaporeans lived in public housing that they personally owned. Try finding that statistic anywhere else in the world. One of the most important keys to Singapore's success was education reform. Lee understood that if they had no natural resources, then their people had to become the resource. Everyone needed to be educated to international standards. Everyone without exception. Many Singaporeans were illiterate at the time, so the government would teach them. They built schools everywhere across the island and made English the primary language of instruction. This was controversial because Singapore had Chinese, Malay, and Indian populations that all spoke different languages. But Lee chose English because it was neutral between the ethnic groups and because it was the language of international business. Singaporean children would be fluent in English and their ethnic mother tongue. They would be able to do business anywhere in the world. Some people accused Lee of erasing local culture, but he didn't care about the criticism. He was playing the long-term game for national survival. Lastly, there was the problem of defense. Remember, Singapore had basically no military in 1965, and they were surrounded by much larger neighbors. Malaysia to the north, Indonesia to the south. What if they decided to invade this vulnerable new nation? Lee decided Singapore needed a real military, and his strategy was to make the country poisonous to swallow. Every male citizen would serve in the military through mandatory conscription. Everyone would learn to fight. If anyone attacked Singapore, it would cost them dearly in blood and resources. Singapore introduced universal military service. Every able-bodied male had to serve. Even today, Singaporean men serve 2 years in the military. The Singapore Armed Forces became one of the most technologically advanced militaries in Southeast Asia, with modern weapons, training, and strategic doctrine that emphasized making any invasion prohibitively expensive. Here's the remarkable thing about all these radical policies. They worked. They really, really worked beyond anyone's expectations. By the 1970s, foreign companies were flooding into Singapore attracted by the business-friendly environment. The port was expanding rapidly. New industries were sprouting across the island. The economy was growing at double-digit rates year after year. Singapore was becoming exactly what Lee had envisioned. The dominant trading hub, the financial center, the essential place to do business in Asia. But Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore wasn't just about economics and growth. It was fundamentally about social control and order. Lee believed in what he called Asian values: social harmony over individual freedom, order over chaos, the collective good over personal liberty. This philosophy meant extremely strict laws. Chewing gum was banned entirely. Littering carried heavy fines. Vandalism could get you caned with a rattan stick as corporal punishment. The government controlled the media tightly and kept a firm grip on newspapers and television. Lee's People's Action Party dominated elections, severely limiting meaningful political opposition. Western countries criticized Singapore as authoritarian and repressive. Lee's response was unapologetic. Look at our results: clean streets, low crime rates, booming economy, high literacy rates, universal healthcare. Maybe Western liberal democracy isn't the only way to successfully run a country. When critics asked about freedom of speech, Lee's response was blunt. You can have all the free speech you want in a failing, chaotic country, or you can have prosperity and order. Most rational people choose prosperity when their families need food and security. Was Lee right? Was he wrong? That's a philosophical debate people still have today. But here's what's completely undeniable. His approach worked spectacularly by almost every measurable metric. Singapore went from third world to first world in a single generation, an unprecedented achievement. By the 1990s, Singapore's GDP per capita exceeded Britain's, the country that had colonized them for over a century. Let that fact sink in for a moment. The slums were gone, replaced by gleaming high-rise buildings. The port was one of the busiest in the entire world. The airport was world-class. The economy was diverse and robust. Singapore had become what economists call an Asian tiger, along with Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan, but arguably the most successful of them all. In 2015, Lee Kuan Yew died at age 91. The entire nation mourned their founding father. People queued for hours in tropical heat to pay their respects. Whatever you thought of his authoritarian methods, you couldn't deny his extraordinary results. He had taken a tiny resource-poor island that everyone thought was doomed to fail, and turned it into one of the most successful countries on Earth with GDP per capita higher than the United States. Not bad for a country whose leader was crying on television in 1965, thinking they were all going to die. Yet, Singapore still faces significant challenges today. The country is aging rapidly as birth rates have fallen. Housing has become extremely expensive despite government programs. The government is trying to maintain its strict social control in an era of social media and globalization that makes information control increasingly difficult. And there's always the existential question of what happens to Singapore's unique authoritarian capitalist model as the founding generation passes away and new leaders take over. Only time will tell how Singapore evolves, but one thing is absolutely certain. Singapore's rise from zero to hero is one of the most remarkable stories in modern history. A tiny island with no natural resources whatsoever became an economic powerhouse in less than 50 years through sheer determination, smart, pragmatic policies, and a leader who absolutely refused to accept failure as an option. As Lee himself said, they had no choice. They either succeeded or they died. And succeed they certainly did. So the next time you hear someone say something is impossible, just remember that Singapore was supposed to be impossible too. What do you think about Singapore's trade-off between freedom and prosperity? Could their authoritarian model work in other countries, or was it unique to their circumstances? Share your perspective in the comments, subscribe for more stories of economic transformation, and let's discuss what lessons other nations can learn from Singapore's remarkable rise.